Abandoned German Shepherd desperately jumps at car windows. Then one moment changes everything. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty road. Among the speeding cars and flickering headlights, a lone figure stood motionless, his dull, dirt-streaked fur barely noticeable against the dusty pavement. His ribs were visible beneath his thin coat, a sign of how long he had gone without food. But hunger wasn't his biggest concern. His eyes were locked on the vehicles passing by, scanning every window, every face, searching desperately for the one person who mattered most to him. He didn't move. He didn't give up. His heart clung to the belief that any moment now, the person who had left him here would return. Days had turned into nights, and still he waited. He had been abandoned, but he didn't understand why. He didn't know that the person he loved had driven away for good. His world had shrunk to this one stretch of asphalt, to the cars that zoomed past, to the faces behind the glass that never looked twice at him. Every time an engine approached, his ears perked up, his tail wagged slightly. Maybe this one. Maybe now. But hope faded each time as the vehicle passed without slowing down. His heart cracked a little more with every disappointment. The road was his prison, but it was also the only place that connected him to the person he had lost. And so he stayed. Then one evening everything changed. A dark-colored car, one that looked painfully similar to the one he had been left in, slowed down near him. His heart pounded with desperate hope. It had to be them. They had finally come back. Before he even thought, his body sprang into action. His paws hit the pavement, his muscles burned, but he ran faster than ever before. He reached the car just in time, leaped up, and slammed his paws against the window. His claws scraped the glass. His whimpering cries filled the air. His eyes, filled with sorrow, begged the people inside to recognize him. Inside the car, a woman gasped. A child shrieked in surprise. "That dog! He just jumped at the window!" someone exclaimed. The driver panicked and hit the gas. The car sped forward. He ran, his legs straining, his breath coming in frantic bursts. His vision blurred from exhaustion, but he didn't stop. He had to reach them. He had to make them see. But his body, weak and malnourished, couldn't keep up. His paws stumbled, his balance faltered, and in an instant he collapsed onto the cold pavement. Dust rose around him as he lay still, his chest heaving, his limbs trembling from exhaustion. His ears rang with the fading sound of the car disappearing into the distance. He had been wrong. Again. It wasn't them. It was never them. His tail curled inward, his body shook, and a deep, mournful whimper escaped his throat. He was truly alone. And yet, even now, even with his heart shattered beyond repair, he still believed. Because believing was all he had left. Before he was a lonely, desperate figure on the road, he had been something else. Someone else. He had known warmth, love, and the comfort of a gentle hand stroking his fur. He had once belonged to a home, a real home, with a roof that shielded him from the rain, with a soft bed where he curled up at night, with a voice that called his name with affection. He had not always been just another stray, just another forgotten soul. But that life felt like a distant dream now, a cruel illusion of the past that teased him in his sleep and haunted him when he woke. He still remembered the smell of his owner's clothes, the sound of their laughter. The memory of it clung to him like a ghost, whispering that maybe, just maybe, things could go back to the way they were. But deep inside, something told him that hope was a dangerous thing to hold on to. His world had once been full of joy. He had been more than just a pet. He had been a best friend, a loyal shadow who followed his owner everywhere. Long walks in the park, lazy afternoons lying by their feet, nights spent curled up beside them as they whispered kind words into his ear. He had known nothing but happiness. His owner had promised him forever, and he had believed it. With every wag of his tail, with every excited bark when they came home, with every devoted look in his eyes, he had given them his heart. He trusted them more than he trusted himself, because to him they were his entire world. But for humans, forever doesn't always mean the same thing. He could never understand why that day had been different, Why the drive that had once meant adventure had instead turned into the worst moment of his life. The car ride had started like any other, his tail wagging, his head sticking out of the window, his tongue flopping in the breeze. He had been happy. He had been excited. Then the car had stopped. Not at the park. Not at home. But somewhere unfamiliar. A lonely road. A place he had never been before. His owner had stepped out. Opened the door. He had jumped out eagerly, expecting playtime, expecting laughter. But the door closed behind him. And when he turned around, the person he loved the most wasn't looking at him with affection anymore. The expression was different, cold, detached. Then, the worst sound in the world, the engine revved. The tires rolled forward. The car pulled away. He had chased after it, his paws pounding against the pavement, his cries desperate and full of confusion. He had run until his legs burned, until his breath came in ragged gasps. His heart had screamed louder than his voice, but it didn't matter. The car disappeared into the horizon, and with it, everything he had ever known. For hours, he had stood in that same spot, staring at the empty road, willing it to bring them back. But no one returned. No one ever would. The moment he was left behind, time seemed to stop. The road stretched endlessly ahead, an empty void of nothingness. Every second that passed without his owner returning was like a dagger twisting in his heart. At first, he was frozen, unable to process what had happened. His tail, once wagging with excitement, drooped between his legs. His ears twitched at the fading sound of the engine. His breath came in short, panicked bursts. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of dust and gasoline, but not the familiar smell of home. He whimpered, pacing back and forth in the same spot, his eyes locked on the road. Surely this was a mistake. Surely they would realize he wasn't in the car and come rushing back. Any minute now, any second. But minutes turned into hours, and the road remained empty. When the sun began to set, he finally understood. He had been left behind. At first, he refused to leave. He curled up beside the road, his body trembling from both cold and fear. Every distant car approaching in the night sent his ears perking up, his heart pounding with hope. But each time, the car would pass without slowing. The headlights would disappear into the darkness, leaving him alone once more. Hunger began to gnaw at him, an unfamiliar ache that deepened as the hours stretched on. His body, once strong and well-fed, felt hollow. But he didn't move. He couldn't. What if they came back and he wasn't here? The first night was the hardest. When the morning sun rose, it brought no relief. Only exhaustion, hunger, and a growing sense of desperation. His body ached from lying on the hard ground, and his once shiny coat was now caked in dust and grime. His legs trembled as he stood, stiff from the cold. He wandered down the roadside, sniffing at the dry grass, searching for anything to eat. But there was nothing. No food, no water, nothing but endless stretches of asphalt and dry dirt. He approached trash bins near a gas station, his stomach twisting with hunger. The scent of discarded food filled his nose, and he pawed at the bags, ripping them open in search of something, anything. But he was not the only one desperate to survive. Other stray dogs lurked nearby, bigger, stronger, more aggressive. The moment he found a half-eaten sandwich, a large, scarred dog snarled and lunged at him. Teeth snapped inches from his face, and instinct took over. He ran. His paws pounded against the pavement as he darted between buildings, his breath ragged. The other dog didn't chase him for long, but the message was clear. He was weak, and weakness had no place in this world. That night, he tried to drink from a puddle in the street, but the water was dirty, filled with oil and grime. Still, his thirst was unbearable, and he lapped at it hesitantly. The foul taste made him gag, but he had no choice. Each day blurred into the next. Hunger became a constant companion. Sleep was no longer restful, but a brief escape from the pain. His ribs started to show beneath his dirty fur. His once bright eyes dulled with exhaustion. Yet, even as his body weakened, his spirit clung to one last thread of hope. The road had betrayed him. It had taken away his owner and given him nothing in return. But still, he refused to leave it behind. Because deep in his heart, he believed that the road was also the only way back home. The first time a car slowed down near him, his heart leaped into his throat. He ran toward it, paws skidding against the pavement, his tail wagging wildly. His eyes searched the window, desperate to see the face he had been waiting for. But the driver wasn't his owner. The window rolled up quickly. The car sped away. He stopped in the middle of the road, watching the dust settle in its wake. Confusion swirled in his tired mind. Why hadn't they stopped? Why hadn't they recognized him? Then another car passed. Then another. And he began to chase them. Each time he jumped at the windows, his front paws hitting the glass, his eyes pleading. Every honk, every startled gasp from the passengers, every time he was pushed away, it didn't matter. He had to keep trying. Because what if the next car was the one? What if his owner had realized their mistake and was coming back? What if they were searching for him just as desperately as he was searching for them? So he kept running, even when his legs ached, even when his body was weak, even when the cars never stopped. But no matter how hard he chased, no matter how many windows he jumped at, his owner never came. The hope that had once burned bright inside him was now fading, flickering like a dying flame. He was running out of time, running out of strength, and soon he wouldn't be able to run at all. The endless stream of cars had become nothing but blurs of disappointment. Each passing vehicle carried with it a fleeting hope that was quickly crushed as it sped away, leaving him behind once more. His paws were sore, his legs trembled, and his once powerful jumps had turned into weak, desperate scrambles against the cold glass of strangers' windows. But then one car did something different. It slowed down. The hum of the engine softened as the vehicle crawled to a stop a few feet away. His ears perked up, his tired eyes widening in disbelief. Was this real? Was someone finally stopping for him? For a moment he hesitated. So many times he had been pushed away, ignored, shooed off as if he were nothing more than a nuisance. But this time felt different. A door creaked open, and for the first time in what felt like forever, a voice, gentle, soothing, broke through the silence. The stranger stepped out of the car, moving slowly, carefully, as if afraid that one wrong move would send the dog bolting into the distance. Their eyes softened at the sight before them. A once strong German shepherd, now frail and exhausted, his fur matted with dirt, his ribs visible beneath his dull coat. His eyes, however, were what struck the hardest. They held a story of pain, of longing, of a heartbreak that no words could ever describe. The stranger crouched down, extending a hand, palm up, offering nothing but patience and kindness. "Hey, buddy. It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." The dog stiffened. This was new. No one had spoken to him like this in a long time. No honking, no shouting, no throwing scraps just to make him leave. Just a voice, steady, warm, inviting. But trust was not something he could give freely anymore. His body tensed, ready to run. The stranger didn't rush him. They didn't make any sudden moves. They simply sat there, allowing the dog to take in their presence, to decide for himself whether they were a threat or something else entirely. Something he had almost forgotten existed. Safety. The dog's nose twitched, catching a scent: food. The stranger had placed a small piece of something on the ground, not too close, just within reach. His stomach twisted painfully. Hunger had become an unbearable force, gnawing at his insides like a relentless predator. Cautiously, he inched forward, his body low, his steps hesitant. His eyes never left the stranger's face, watching for any sign of deception. The stranger remained still, patient. Finally, he sniffed the food, fresh, real. With one last glance at the stranger, he devoured it, his body shaking as he swallowed. It was the first real meal he had eaten in days. The stranger didn't try to touch him, didn't try to grab him. They simply spoke again, their voice as soft as before. "There's more if you want it. You don't have to be afraid." A choice lay before him: run, as he had always done, or take a chance on something new. For the first time since he had been abandoned, he felt the smallest flicker of something he thought he had lost forever. Hope. The moment the car door shut behind him, something inside the abandoned dog shifted. For weeks, he had been running, searching, hoping, only to be met with disappointment. But now, as the warmth of the vehicle wrapped around his frail body, he felt something unfamiliar, a feeling he had almost forgotten. Safety. His tired muscles finally relaxed, his breathing slowed, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't bracing for rejection. He wasn't jumping at another passing car, begging for someone to notice him. Someone already had. And this time, they weren't driving away. The car ride was quiet, except for the gentle hum of the engine. The dog curled up in the back seat, his body tense but his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Every now and then, he lifted his head, glancing at the stranger driving him away from his painful past. Would they abandon him too? Was this kindness only temporary? But each time he looked, the stranger glanced back, their eyes filled with something he wasn't used to seeing anymore: compassion. "Don't worry, buddy. We're almost home," they murmured, their voice steady and soothing. Home. The word felt foreign, like a distant memory from a life that no longer existed. But as the car pulled into a driveway and the door opened, he hesitated, stepping out cautiously. The air smelled different here. No asphalt, no exhaust fumes, just fresh grass and something warm drifting from the house. The stranger walked ahead, giving him space, leaving the door open in case he wanted to follow. He stood there, uncertain, torn between the instinct to flee and the deep, aching desire to belong. Then hunger won over fear. He took a step forward. Inside, a soft bed replaced the cold, hard pavement he had slept on for weeks. A bowl of fresh food was placed nearby, but there was no rush, no urgency, just patience. He ate slowly, savoring every bite, his body still weak but grateful. Later that night, as he lay curled up in the corner, his eyes fought against sleep. His mind whispered old fears. What if this was temporary? What if, by morning, he was alone again? But when he finally closed his eyes, the last thing he heard was the steady breathing of the stranger who had saved him, the sound of someone who wasn't leaving. The first few days were difficult. Every small noise made him flinch. The sound of a closing door sent his heart racing. Any sudden movement made him cower, expecting a harsh hand or an angry voice. But none came. The stranger, his rescuer, moved gently, spoke softly, and never forced him to do anything before he was ready. They let him take his time, allowing trust to grow at its own pace. At first, he kept his distance, staying in the farthest corner of the room. But slowly, curiosity won over fear. He began creeping closer, sniffing the edges of this new life. One day, he allowed a cautious sniff of the stranger's hand. Another day, he accepted a soft pat on his head. And then, the biggest moment of all, he wagged his tail. Just once, barely noticeable, but it was there. His rescuer saw it, and they smiled. Healing wasn't just about physical recovery, it was about learning to trust again. And trust, for a dog who had known nothing but betrayal, was the hardest thing of all. But every time his rescuer came home, they greeted him with warmth. Every meal arrived like clockwork, never failing. Every night, a soft blanket was waiting for him, as if to remind him that he belonged here. Slowly, his past began to fade. The painful memories of being left behind were replaced by new ones, of gentle hands, kind words, and a warmth he had never expected to feel again. And then, one morning, something incredible happened. As his rescuer sat down on the couch, he made a choice. He walked over, hesitated for just a second, then rested his head on their lap. His rescuer froze, startled by the sudden gesture. Then, with a quiet smile, they ran a hand through his fur. "You're safe now," they whispered. And for the first time since he had been abandoned, he believed it. He wasn't searching anymore. He was home. Just as life was beginning to settle into a quiet rhythm, something unexpected happened. The dog, once lost and hopeless, had found warmth, security, and trust in his rescuer. But fate had one more surprise waiting, something neither of them could have ever seen coming. One evening, as they walked through the park, something changed. The dog, usually cautious and hesitant around strangers, suddenly froze. His body tensed, his ears perked up, and his nose twitched furiously as if catching a scent he had never expected to smell again. His rescuer watched, puzzled, as the dog's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. Then, without warning, he bolted. The leash tightened as the dog pulled forward, his strength almost overwhelming. His rescuer struggled to keep up, calling his name, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Something in the air had triggered a memory buried deep within his soul. A scent so familiar, so deeply ingrained in his heart, that it overpowered every other thought. His paws pounded against the ground as he led his rescuer through the park, weaving through crowds, his breath quick and desperate. And then he stopped abruptly. His rescuer followed his gaze, and saw a figure standing near a bench, unaware of what was about to happen. The dog's body trembled, his tail wagged slightly, but there was hesitation in his stance. Could it really be? A person turned their head at the sound of heavy breathing and scraping paws, and in that moment time seemed to stand still. The person gasped, their eyes widening in disbelief. It was them, the one who had once been his entire world, the owner who had disappeared from his life, leaving him to fend for himself. But the emotions on their face weren't what his rescuer had expected. There was no coldness, no rejection. Instead, there was shock, regret, and something even deeper, pain. Tears welled in the person's eyes as they slowly knelt, extending a shaky hand. The dog hesitated, his heart pounding. Did he remember the pain of abandonment, or the love he once knew? His rescuer watched, unsure of what would happen next. Would he turn away? Would he run back to the one who had left him behind? Then the dog took a cautious step forward. His nose twitched, taking in the scent, confirming what his heart already knew. And then he leapt, not with fear, not with anger, but with the kind of joy that can only come from finding something that was once lost. His tail wagged wildly, his cries filled with emotions no words could describe. The person wrapped their arms around him, whispering apologies, their tears soaking into his fur. His rescuer stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. What had happened? Why had this dog been left behind in the first place? Then, through broken words and deep regret, the truth came out. A tragedy, a loss, a misunderstanding that had led to the most heartbreaking separation. The owner had never meant to abandon him. They had searched, they had grieved, believing he was gone forever. And now, fate had brought them back together in the most unexpected way. His rescuer's heart swelled with emotions. Joy for the dog, but also a deep sadness. Would he leave? Would he go back to the life he once had? But then, the dog did something surprising. He turned his head, looking back at the one who had saved him, the one who had given him a second chance when he had no hope left. His tail wagged as if to say, "I remember you, too." And at that moment it became clear. This was not just a story of abandonment. It was a story of second chances. And love, no matter how lost, always finds its way home. After everything, the heartbreak, the struggle, the despair, fate had worked in a way no one could have expected. A dog left to fend for himself, a rescuer who had given him hope, and an owner who had never stopped mourning his loss. 3 lives forever intertwined by a story that defied all odds. But the question remained, what would happen next? Would the dog return to his original owner? Or had his heart found a new home with the one who had saved him? The answer was more beautiful than anyone could have imagined. The reunion had been filled with raw emotion, tears, apologies, and endless embraces. But the truth was, time had changed everything. The dog had spent so long searching for his past that he had never imagined finding a new future. His original owner, overcome with guilt and sorrow, knelt before his rescuer and spoke the words that no one had expected. "You saved him when I couldn't. You gave him love when he had none. He's happy with you. I can see it. And I could never take that away." Tears welled up in his rescuer's eyes. They had never imagined this moment, never thought they would have to make a choice. But as they looked down at the dog, the one who had once been so broken, so desperate, they saw the answer written in his gentle, trusting eyes. He had already made his choice. This was his home now. The original owner nodded, understanding, though it was bittersweet. They reached out one last time, stroking the fur of the companion they had thought they'd lost forever. And as if sensing the weight of the moment, the dog nuzzled into them, not as a goodbye, but as a silent promise. You will always be a part of me. And with that, the chapter of his painful past finally closed, making way for a new beginning. Life didn't just go back to normal, it became something even better. No longer jumping at car windows in search of someone who wasn't coming back, no longer wandering the streets with empty eyes, the dog had finally found what he had been searching for all along. Not just a home, but a family. With every wag of his tail, every joyful bark, and every peaceful night spent curled up in warmth, he proved that love could heal even the deepest wounds. He was no longer abandoned. He was no longer desperate. He was loved. And for the first time in a long time, his heart was finally at peace. This incredible journey reminds us that no animal should ever feel abandoned, unloved, or forgotten. Countless dogs are still out there, waiting for their second chance, waiting for someone like you to notice them. If this story touched your heart, consider visiting your local shelter, supporting rescue organizations, or even adopting a pet in need. Every act of kindness can change a life. And remember, love has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. What are your thoughts on this emotional reunion? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming stories that prove love always finds a way home.